It has been exactly a week. All right. So, let's do this. Chapter 23. So if you grab your notes, however you've been working through those or wherever those go, grab those, get them ready. And so, chapter 23 is there are two ways to think about what chapter 23 covers. Chapter 23, the title of it is Evolution of Populations. And the reason why it's called this, or references this, because it needs to remind you that evolution does not happen at the level of individuals. Individuals do not change through their lifetime to adapt to their environment, although they actually kind of do, but we'll save that conversation for another time because it complicates this a little bit. So this is one way to do this. It's just a reminder. Individuals don't evolve. Populations do. Populations evolve to adapt to their environment as allele frequencies change. But another way you can think of 23 is this. Microevolution. So evolution of populations, which literally just means change of populations. But microevolution, what does this mean? Yeah, Katie.
Change within a species.
It is.
But like slight change.
Yeah, and what's changing? Mark?
It's like characteristics. But
Yes.
it's kind of like maybe if like there's like bears or something like that, and like they live in the Arctic, and one of them and if there's like brown, it turns white.
Okay, so you're getting some morphological changes. What microevolution is it's change in allele frequencies. Change in allele frequencies. That's what microevolution is. So again, chapter 23 you can think of as evolution of populations, or you can think of chapter 23 as microevolution. Change in allele frequencies. And we've already dealt a little bit with allele frequencies already, right? We have P and we have Q. And in a simple illustration in which you only have two alleles, P is the frequency of what?
The frequency of the
Dominant allele. And don't worry, we'll talk a whole lot about Mendelian genetics in a bit. Not yet, but we'll get there.
This one's frequency of recessive.
And then Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. And so what chapter 23 is chapter 23 is a discussion of when will these frequencies change and how will these frequencies change. But we already saw this in our lab, right?
Yeah.
Two of our forces then to carry out microevolution are what? What are two of those forces? According to our simulations that we did in lab. Emma.
Natural selection.
Natural selection and drift. Good. Good. Okay, so, all right. The text uses the illustration to show you. The text uses the illustration of Galapagos finches, specifically finches on Daphne Major, I believe. Daphne Major, one of the islands in the Galapagos archipelago. And it uses the average beak depth, the average size of the beak, to illustrate how microevolution works, how populations evolve. That following a drought, a lot of the small seeds got eaten and weren't replaced because the plants producing those small seeds could not thrive under drought conditions. All that was left was large seeds. So the population shifts to accommodate eating larger food items. All right, so beak depth increases. All right? Okay, so in lab, again, we saw two forces that facilitate microevolution. One of those was natural selection. The other one was genetic drift. Natural selection is adaptive. Natural selection is adaptive, and what does that mean? What word have we talked about already in this class that starts with the same 5 letters? What were you going to say? Just tell me what you were going to say for adaptive.
Oh, like so the creators are going to like one environment, and if it adapted to the new.
Yeah, so they're becoming better equipped to handle the environmental conditions, right? They're becoming better equipped to thrive in whatever that environment is. And Jade, you were going to give us the word we've talked about already that starts with the same 5 letters. What is it? Adaptation, right? Which is, we talked about as a feature that makes a population better equipped for its environment, right? So natural selection is adaptive, and we saw that in lab because we were eating them selectively based on their characteristics. Who was getting eaten more, the cheddar or the pretzel? The cheddar, right? So the pretzel, there was something about it that enabled it to survive better against the predation. Okay? And then from there, you know, our allele frequencies change. Whereas drift is random, right? You closed your eyes, or somehow you randomly chose 4 fish to eat, and then you randomly picked 4 fish to replace them. All right? So genetic drift is random. There's one more force, and that's gene flow. Gene flow. How do genes flow? What does the word flow mean? Yeah.
Oh, are you talking how there's like it has a beginning and then it goes to an end? It's not a cycle, like it doesn't repeat.
Yeah, right. We saw this before when we were talking about ecology.
Yeah.
We said nutrients cycle, but energy flows, right? What else flows? Water flows, right? Like a river flows. What were you gonna say, Issa?
I was gonna say water, but
Water?
that's stupid.
No. It's a good illustration to have in your mind. So as water flows, it moves from a place of higher elevation to a place of lower elevation, right? Water flows downhill, which is why the sewage line draining your house slopes down, right? I don't know if you knew that or not.
I seen it all over me. When I was little, I would like play it with the bikes,
Oh
and like I would splash in it. My legs were covered in it. It was
That's really gross.
It was.
All right.
I was just like, oh.
So if we're talking about gene flow,
Full water.
we're not talking about gene cycling. We're talking about gene flow. So how are genes going to flow? Somebody figure this out for me. What does this mean then? Mark.
I'm saying, I'm thinking that maybe through mating, kind of like the genes from each individual that may kind of flow into like.
That's going to create us some more of a cycling, right? Is as individuals mate and produce offspring, and then those offspring have characteristics that may be better or more randomly. But what about flow? So it's a one-way movement of genetic material.
How would it, like in his case, like how would it be a cycle if it doesn't go like? And I don't see that the genes are always being passed.
Because, so, yes, they're always being passed down, so you've got a vertical movement of genetic material, right? But as far as the population is concerned, nothing's leaving or entering, right? There's no flow of information. It's more of just yes, you do have a vertical movement of that, right? It's not going back to the ancestors. Mark.
Do you I'm gonna basically take a very slight alteration to what I said. This can be basically the same thing. Like it's like would it involve like maybe like a different species that have like basically very very similar characteristics. Maybe maybe like we'll say like a small beaked finch.
Sure.
Mating with a large beaked
Sure.
finch, and then would that create the gene?
Maybe. So, Emma.
Like the gene be bred out.
Bred out?
Yeah, you know, like sometimes.
Yeah, so that usually happens as either a process of natural selection or a process of sexual selection, which is a type of natural selection. So gene flow is from immigration or immigration? Individuals bring new genetic material into the population, or individuals take genetic information out of the population. Immigration, immigration. Okay? So these are our three mechanisms of microevolution. And sexual selection is a type of natural selection. Okay? But natural selection is adapted for better survival. Sexual selection adapted for better reproductive success. Either way, they're two different types of natural selection. Darwin talked a lot about sexual selection as an example of natural selection, and how it could actually work. All right, does this make sense? So these are our three mechanisms. Emma.
So say like two of the same species are being bred together. How is it possible?
Two individuals.
Oh, individuals, yeah.
Okay.
How is it possible for a gene to not be given to the offspring? Like if they both have it.
If they both have
Yeah,
it.
is that possible?
Well, it depends on how many copies of it they have. So, sexually reproducing organisms tend to have two copies of the genome. And so, if you have two copies, you have the same two versions of the gene, you have to pass at least one of them off to your offspring. Doesn't mean it's going to be expressed in your offspring, because it could be masked by something else. But if you have two of the same copies, you have to pass that on. But if you have two different copies, right? And the other, let's say the male then has two different copies, but so you could end up not passing on one of those, even if you both have at least one copy of the dominant. Are you getting into like if you have two organisms with the dominant characteristic, how do they produce offspring that has a recessive characteristic? Yeah, again, we'll talk all about Mendelian inheritance in a few chapters. Yeah, Kate.
So what's the difference between genetic drift and genetic flow? Or gene flow?
Well, so genetic drift are random changes due to individuals either not reproducing or dying. I mean, either way, if they die, they're not reproducing. But genetic drift is random genetic changes based on some individuals not reproducing.
Okay.
Gene flow is still, I guess, somewhat random, although usually it's very predictable. So gene flow, you can usually predict how it's going to happen. If you have a lot of individuals immigrating into the population, you can predict gene flow. Genetic drift is very rarely predictable.
Okay.
Unless you have like a small portion of your population leaves and goes somewhere, then you can predict that. But all right. So mechanisms of microevolution. We have P and we have Q. And we know that P plus Q is equal to 1, right? P is the proportion of the dominant allele, or frequency of the dominant allele. Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. Now notice, something has to already be in place in order for microevolution to happen. And what's that?
You did the P and the Q,
Right, you have to have the P and the Q. Right? So if you're going to change frequencies... Well, you only have to know one to find the other, but you have to have both are present, right? So in order for microevolution to be possible, if microevolution is going to happen, you must have variation in place. Okay? You cannot have microevolution without variation. So then we have a question. And the question is, where does this variation come from? Where does the variation come from?
Are you recording?
I am. At least I think so. Where does the variation come from? Any ideas here? Where does this variation come from? How do we get it? So we need at least two different alleles in order for microevolution to happen. If you only have one allele, microevolution can't happen. If all we have is P is 100% of the alleles always, right? But if you have Q, you can now change P and Q. If all you have is P, it has to be 100% always. We can't change it. Isa.
Wait, what do you mean P is 100% of the alleles?
If there's no Q, then P has to equal 1,
Yeah.
right? So if we add in Q, we add in a second allele, or if we add in a third or a fourth or a fifth, they're always going to have to equal 1 because all of our alleles together have to account for 100% of the versions of that gene. But if all we have is 1, it can't change. It always has to be 100%. Yeah, Katie.
Does it come from like the we were talking about how they all the same like species will relate back to one like main animal?
Right, so
like from that animal?
yeah, so the source variation, right? So where does the variation come from? We can account for some of it. So what you're getting at there is additional variation can come from gene flow. Right? Gene flow can actually increase the variation. We can have individuals bring in new alleles. Right? But then this is kind of kicking the can down the road, right? It didn't come from here, it came from somewhere else, but where did it come from in that somewhere else? Right? You're like, okay, if you're on one of the Galapagos Islands, this variation came from the mainland. But where did the mainland population get it? Jesus? So one of them, one source is going to be mutations. One source of variation is going to be mutations. Yeah,
So
Isa.
you know how we were talking about random,
Genetic changes.
no, random, what's the spacing thing?
Oh, random
So you know how
distributions.
things kind of get like blown in there? Could that be a way things kind of happen? Kids kind of end up there.
Yeah, so that would be more like gene flow.
Oh shoot! I forgot we're talking about. Okay, never mind. That was stupid. Never mind.
No, I gotcha.
I forgot we're talking about genes.
Michelle.
Why mutation?
Yeah, so mutations are where the genetic information changes. Now, mutations could be the result of a copying error, right? When the DNA is copied, and again, we'll talk about mutations and how they happen. But as the DNA is being copied, you could copy it wrong. You could get a mutation that way, or you can have something that's called a mutagen that actually changes the genetic information. Radiation does this. Viruses do this.
So just genetic material.
Right. Yep. So changing the genetic material. Jade. Immigration, yeah, so that's going to be under gene flow. So another one is what's called recombination, is another source of variation. Recombination. Let's see, let me write this and see if you remember this. Crossing over during meiosis 1, specifically prophase 1. Don't worry, we'll get there. We'll do it again.
Where they line up and
Scrambling, basically recombination is scrambling information. Okay, true or false? Yeah, you know what I'm gonna say. True or false? You have 2 entire copies of your genome in most of your cells. True. True or false? Those 2 copies came, one from your mother, one from your father.
False. False.
True.
I was gonna say
True. Okay, so I was gonna say we're in a good place, but we're in a scary place. All right. So you have 2 copies of the genome in most of your cells. One of those copies came from your mom. One of those copies came from your dad. Emma.
So let's say like my dad had blonde hair and my mom had brown hair. I would have like one blonde thing.
Potentially, you could. Hair color is a little bit more complicated than that. It's not determined by a single gene, but then it's hard to know exactly what your mom's genetics look like. So let's assume it was controlled by a single gene. and brown was always dominant to blonde. It's sort of that way, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Your mom could have 2 copies of the brown, or she could have 1 copy of the brown and 1 copy of the blonde, right? And then your dad, if he has blonde hair, basically has to have 2 copies of blonde because brown is dominant to blonde, right? And it's not perfectly that way, but it's sort of that way. And you have siblings.
Yeah.
Do all of your siblings have brown hair?
Yeah.
Do you just have one?
Yeah, I have a brother.
Oh, just one brother. Man, you're lucky. My sister had 2 brothers, and gosh, we still give her trouble. Isa.
So you know how there's like a recessive and dominant?
Yes,
So you know how like you have red hair?
I do know that. Yes.
In case you were wondering.
Yeah.
Good. So is red always recessive or just
No, red is actually dominant.
really?
So yes, but so red is a completely separate type of pigment, but it often gets masked. So you can cover up the fact that you're producing red if you also produce brown.
So but none of your kids got red.
None of my kids have red hair.
Why is that?
Why is that? Although both my daughters have red highlights, so they have red in their hair, they're producing that red pigment, but it's being masked by the brown pigment they're producing
So
that
it's
came from my wife.
recessive, right?
Well, it's not that simple. It's more of like a what you would call a co-dominance,
Okay.
that they're both being expressed, but you don't see the red because the brown is overwhelming it.
Gotcha.
And then so what'll happen a lot of the times is you'll start to see red come up in beards. Because beard hair, the actual hair fibers are thicker, but the what's the follicles aren't as dense, don't typically get as dense, and so you can see it more easily in beards than in hair. Yeah.
So, this might be like stupid, but I heard I always thought that, well, everyone always said that kids tend to get their mom's hair. Is that depending on whether the other side is dominant,
So with baldness, that tends to be true because one of the major genetic factors for determining male pattern baldness is on the X chromosome. And if you're male, you got your X chromosome, you only have one and you got it from your mother. Right? And so for male pattern baldness, a major contributor to that comes from your mother's side because you can't get an X. I shouldn't say you can't. You usually don't because it is possible to get an X and a Y from your father and end up being XXY. So but anyways, we'll talk about all this. That gets a little bit more complicated. So now for females, you can inherit pattern baldness from your father because you've got 2 X chromosomes, one from your mother and one from your father. So.
but the hair type or color doesn't really.
No.
Me and my brother both got my mom's hair, and
Yeah, I would say it's probably now. So it's hard. Again, a lot of human features are not what you would call sex determined, but they're sex influenced. And again, we'll talk about all these different inheritance in a couple of weeks. Emma.
I don't know if this is dumb, but can you create genes?
Yes.
You can?
Sure.
What's the ingredient?
Absolutely. But are you getting at can you make new alleles for an already present gene, or can you make entirely new genes? Because the answer to both of that is yes.
How do you even do that?
We may talk about that. You have to know what a gene typically looks like and all of the ingredients that go into producing a gene. But yeah, absolutely, you can make a gene. Mark.
I personally just know that the whole idea of the hair the kid's getting mom's hair is not necessarily true.
Yeah, it's more complicated than that.
Due to the fact that I would have my mom's hair. My mom's hair is brown. My hair is brown. My brother's hair however he bleaches hair, but it was dirty blonde.
Yeah. So it is more complicated than that.
Dirty blonde in our family.
Now I will say that that male pattern baldness tends to be inherited from your mom's side. And again, that's because the major factor controlling that is on the X chromosome.
Okay, so we never knew, like, I have red hair, but neither of my parents or any of my grandparents have red hair. And so, but my mom remembered, like, my grandpa had red in his beard, and so that makes
Yeah.
Does your mom have red hair?
No, she has red hair.
Yeah. All right. Hang on. Hold it for just a moment because I started this true false and then everything deteriorated. I mean, it didn't deteriorate. Everything shifted. Let's say that. Okay. So we left off. You have 2 copies of your genome. One came from your mom, one came from your dad. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. When you go to make gametes, you can take some of your mom's features and mix them with some of your dad's features to produce gametes that have never existed before.
Recombination.
And that's what recombination is. That's this idea here. So you are creating mixes that have never existed before. And you're like, what do you mean? Like, I'm a mix of my parents. Yes, but not an actual chromosomal mix. Like your chromosome 1, you have one from your dad and one from your mom. They don't mix until you start to make gametes. And then so now the chromosome 1 you put into your gametes, eggs if you're female, sperm if you're male, are going to be a combination of your mom's chromosome 1 and your dad's chromosome 1. And so that's what recombination is, and it's an additional source of variation. So we'll go Tori, then Trinity.
Wait, can you say that one more time?
Yes, so when you go to make gametes, you're only going to put 1 copy of chromosome 1 into your gamete. Because whereas most of the cells in your body have 2 entire copies of the genome, your gametes can only have 1.
Which is gonna
Because-
have half of your mom and your dad's.
Well, statistically, yes. It should have half of your mom's features, half of your dad's, but that's not always how it works.
It could be like
Statistically speaking, sure, it could be, technically speaking, it could be 100% your mom and 0 from your dad. Something weird, and I think I mentioned this, did I mention this already in this class? That I am 1/8 Miami Indian, but I have 0 Miami Indian genetic markers. Which means Miami Indian, it's a small tribe it's in the Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois.
That's so confusing.
Well, there's Miami University of Ohio. It's named after the Miami Indians. Yeah. So it's where Big Ben Roethlisberger went to college. Big Ben Roethlisberger. He's quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Come on, he's gonna be a Hall of Famer. Come on, you're better than that.
Yeah.
All right. So are we okay with this? This is an additional source of variation because you're creating unique combinations. And those unique combinations could do something really, really interesting. Yeah, Emma.
I know, like, mountain lion cubs are born with blue eyes and then their eyes turn auburn. Like, some children are born with blue eyes. Like, my eyes are blue and now they're brown. Like, is that just because, like, the dominant gene?
So human eye color is determined by at least 16 different genes. 16. There are at least 16 different genes that contribute to human eye color. So human eye color is very complicated. It tends to change throughout the life of the individual. And if you actually look closely at somebody's eyes, there's an enormous amount of difference. So like you can have 5 people that all have brown eyes, and then yet the amount of blue that they have in their eye differs, the amount of green that they have, the amount of yellow that they have. It's just, there's an enormous amount of variation. Lydia.
Okay, so what if I
I took her on her birth certificate, it says her eye color is hazel.
Uh-huh.
Like her eyes were never actually hazel, her eyes like reflected like light. So they
Yeah.
had like berry colors like green, blue, purple.
Yeah.
Ooh. So is there like a name for that?
It would just go under hazel. I mean, there's really not. It's so difficult because your choices are basically blue, green, brown, and hazel. There are others, like there are gray, but I mean they're so rare that you basically have to put it into one of those 4 common categories. And so again, but just a huge amount of variation. Tori,
So then how does heterochromia happen?
where you have 2 different eye colors. Again, it has to do with how pigment gets deposited. So you could have an issue depositing pigment in one eye, and so it should have a lot of brown in it, but you're not depositing pigment in it, so it ends up being blue. Yeah.
So
It's the same. It's something similar to when people have
The white.
what was it? Alopecia? Is that what it's called? Where you can't deposit pigment in some regions of your body. It's similar.
So it's not necessarily like when I color your mom, when I color your dad.
Not usually. No.
It's like normally brown.
Yeah.
Nice.
Issa, did you have something?
Oh, I was just gonna say that yeah, some brown eyes are like yeah, like if my eyes in the sunlight, they get like green.
Yeah.
But like normally they're just
Yeah.
not shaded.
All right. So the last source of variation is gene duplication, and so this is where if you take a gene that's already functional and you duplicate it, create a second copy of that gene. Okay? And so the second copy doesn't need to be functional, right? Because you already have one functional copy. It's like if you have a picture and you make a copy of that picture, only one of those needs to hang up on the wall, right? The other one you can do with as you will, right? Draw some silly mustache on it. I don't know. All right. Okay? Is this all right? Okay, so all of this to say that we have to have some source of variation. All right? And then you should predict that within a population, you're going to have a decent amount of variation, especially if your population is big enough that the environment is different in different places in the population, right? So if your population is big enough, let's think human population, right? I mean, we're basically at a point now where there is one major human population and then several subpopulations, and then there are some truly reproductively isolated populations, or at least mostly so. Like there are some Aboriginal tribes in New Zealand and Australia and other places in Southeast Asia. There are some rural tribes in South America and in Africa. There are some populations, like say the Amish in North America, where they are almost truly reproductively isolated. But for the most part, we have one human population. This is a massive population, right? Big enough that there's a lot of geographical differences. And so you'd expect the variation to correlate with those geographical variations. Make sense? Okay, Isa.
It's a little off topic, but you know how like back then, there's no like modern medicine or anything like that. Do you think there's like natural solutions to like sicknesses because there was no medicine back then? Obviously, they had to some way.
Oh, sure. Now, are they effective? So, yeah. So there you have two different questions. Do some of them work? Sure. Are they effective? That's like, can they work better than something else? Those are two
So they were just
completely different questions. Well, the life expectancy was really, really low until you had your Industrial Revolution. All right. So there's one thing I want to talk about, and then we'll do our lecture break, and we'll talk about our lab. Okay. So again, variation within or between populations. So within a single population or between two populations, right? Those words okay? So variation within or between populations often correlates, there's no either, correlates with environmental variation. Bless you. Okay? So this is one thing I want you to know and I want you to be comfortable talking about. And so if you were asked a question or you're given data on the AP exam and it shows you something like this. Oh gosh, that's terrible. It gives you something like this. And then here is, I don't know, number of red blood cells per liter of blood. And then over here, you have elevation. Okay? So liter of red blood cells on the number of red blood cells per liter of blood on the y-axis. You have elevation on the x-axis. And you see something that looks like this. That you would be able to describe what's going on here. Okay? First off, how would you describe this relationship? Is it positive? Is it negative? It's positive. As one increases, so does the other. As elevation increases, so does the number of red blood cells per liter of blood. Okay, so that's one thing you need to be able to do, to describe the relationship. Another thing you need to be able to do is to describe that what you may be looking at here is what's called a cline. What's called a cline, and that is your variation within a population or between populations is correlating with environmental differences. Do you see that? There is a correlation between an environmental variation and phenotypic variation. Okay? And so this would be an example of what's called a cline. That as you move up in elevation, you have a very predictable impact on the phenotype of an organism. Yeah, Tori.
Wait, so cline is variation within population and what else?
Cline, this is what a cline is.
Oh.
It's variation within or between populations correlating with environmental variation. And in this case, the environmental variation is very predictable. In this case, it's based on elevation as we're increasing in elevation. And we see a very predictable and obvious trend in whatever this phenotype is. Yeah, Isa.
Is this little like stoop? Is that kind of like, oh, you're getting used to it?
Well, this stoop is that probably between certain elevations, there's enough of a similarity in the amount of oxygen that you don't need an increase in the number of red blood cells per liter. But I don't know if you knew this or not, but as you increase in elevation, the percent oxygen in air decreases. And so this is something you tend to find in all mammals as they vary among elevations. So you see this in humans, you see this in bovids like deer and goats. And so if you take a human that lives in the Himalayan mountains and you compare their red blood cells per liter of blood to a human that lives here at about 1,000 feet above sea level, they're going to have significantly more red blood cells per liter of blood than you would. Because of what we call a cline, a variation in phenotype that correlates with environmental variation.
So we have less blood?
No, you don't have less blood, you have less red blood cells per liter of blood.
What are I forgot the red ones.
The red one carries oxygen. Yep. Carries oxygen. Hemoglobin. Yep. All right. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording. Okay. All right. So, the couple more things we need to talk about from chapter 23. One is we've already talked about the mechanisms of microevolution. So we need to talk about this Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is what we've been using to calculate all of our allele frequencies. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay? And so this assumes that there is no microevolution. Bless you. So we were using this to calculate our allele frequencies, but again, we were assuming that there was no evolution, but we know that there was, right? Because we were subjecting our populations to either natural selection or to drift. Which means that it's possible that what we came up with for P and Q were not actually true based on our data, but that's okay. I just want you to know we were assuming Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which this assumes that there is no microevolution. No microevolution. And in order for this to be true, there have to be 5 things that are also true if there's no evolution. 1 is that there are no mutations. So that's one assumption of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Again, it assumes that there is no evolution. If there's no evolution, there can't be any mutations. Number 2, no gene flow. So you do not have individuals leaving your population. You do not have individuals entering your population. Number 3, your population is large enough that drift isn't an issue. Sometimes you'll see this written as the assumption is your population is infinitely large. It's kind of a silly assumption. Now, the math assumes that, but, I mean, in reality, it's just what we're getting at is that the population is large enough that drift isn't an issue. The population is large enough that even if you have individuals randomly not reproducing, it's such a significantly small part of your population, it doesn't matter. Yeah, Katie.
That's what I was wondering.
That's what you were going to ask?
Yeah.
Number 4 is you're assuming that no individuals survive any better than others. No individuals survive any better than others.
Is that just like natural selection?
Yes. So that's you're assuming that there's no natural selection in either survival or reproductive capabilities. Because 4 is no individuals survive any better than others. And number 5 is individuals choose mates by random.
So there's
Like eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Or what do you get? Do you get the little flower thing to help you make decisions? Right?
You mean the love
Oh, you could do that too. Yeah. Okay, so individuals choose mates by random. No individuals survive any better than others. Both of these are basically there's no form of natural selection. Individuals aren't surviving any better, and they're not reproducing any better because of some feature that they have, right? Like peacocks with the long, very impressive, beautiful tail. Okay, so these are assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which again assumes that there is no microevolution, which in order for that to be true, you can't have mutations, you can't have gene flow, you can't have genetic drift be a significant factor, and you can't have natural selection. All right? Is that okay? So this gives you an idea of when genetic drift is going to be powerful. Okay? So this right here, this is all about genetic drift. Right? It says population is large enough that drift isn't an issue. So obviously this one is all about genetic drift. Would you agree?
Yeah.
All right. Cool. On the same page. Okay, so drift is powerful in small populations. And generates random change. Okay? So genetic drift is powerful in small populations. It generates random change. And it can eliminate or fix an allele. Okay? So genetic drift, powerful in small populations, generates random change, and can eliminate or fix an allele. Notice I underlined fix. Because we've got to figure out what that means. What does it mean? It gives us the idea here that it is the opposite of eliminate, right? Can eliminate or fix. What's the opposite of eliminate something? So let's say you've got, oh, go ahead. So that could be the opposite.
To like nourish, to like ensure that it stays.
Yes, and not just ensure that it stays, but 100% of individuals have it. The other extremes. Okay, and so drift can completely eliminate an allele, or it can fix it, which means that now 100% of individuals have it. And so, have you ever seen a population of animals that had some really bad feature? Anyone, can any of you think of any examples of this, that you have an animal that just has some really bad feature that makes it really difficult for that animal to survive? Yeah, Jade.
Albinism?
Okay, albinism is an interesting one. So where you can't deposit any pigment, and so you get like white, completely white versions of squirrels or albino rhinos.
I don't know if this counts, but like, since ants are really small, a lot of things can kill them easily.
Yeah, but I mean they're just so overwhelming, and most of their colony lives underground. Ants are a different issue. We'll talk about ants in the future.
What about like flies? The same thing applies to
Yeah, I mean we'll talk about those in the future. Yeah,
Can that be the case?
yeah, panda bears. So panda bears have some very unusual features, including panda bears basically eat one thing, and only that one thing. They eat bamboo and nothing else.
Oh, really?
And so in places where you've got rapid development happening, or even slow development happening, and you're pulling out bamboo, I mean that's all they eat. And you're like, wow, it's not really an effective strategy on future survival. Plus, I mean it's really difficult to get pandas to reproduce. It is really, really difficult.
Why?
Can
I-
you just artificially
know.
inseminate?
You can. Yeah.
Eat a panda.
Emma.
How fast can pandas run?
I don't know. Probably pretty comparable to a black bear, I would guess. Which a black bears can run like 30, 40 miles an hour for short stretches. I don't know. I've never seen. Every time I've seen a panda bear in a zoo, they're just chilling, like laying on their back eating bamboo. You know.
What do
I've never
pandas eat inside of the bamboo? Like, what do they like in the bamboo? Like, do they just eat the whole thing, or like?
No, they eat the stalk of the. I mean, they'll eat the leaves as well, but a lot of it they eat what would be like the trunk if it was a tree, but it's not. Yeah.
So like, are they herbivores?
Yes, they are entirely herbivorous.
Wow, that's cool.
Which most bears are mostly herbivorous, like black bears. Yeah, I said mostly herbivorous. That a big portion of their diet is plant material. They do mix in some others.
I thought they ate people.
Black black bears don't eat people. Black bears are like some of the most skittish animals that exist.
Like one.
Yeah.
Panda, like they need an air conditioner sometimes.
Oh, and need an air conditioner.
Yeah, because
They overheat easily. Yeah. So
Are pandas like actually really aggressive?
no.
Or is that koalas?
Well, koala bears sleep like 23 and a half hours a day, so I think of people that I know that sleep a long time, they're pretty aggressive when they're awake too, so I think there might be a correlation there. Alright, so now you guys got me all, another really good example are cheetahs. Cheetahs have just a ton of genetic issues. Yeah, so cheetahs.
They run too fast, like
Yeah,
too many calories, they can't punch themselves.
Well, there's that, and then like their hearts beat way too fast. They get way too warm, So like they, in the midst of a chase, a cheetah's body temperature gets up to like 106, 107 degrees Fahrenheit. Like,
Moving too fast.
yeah.
Do they like eat?
I was thinking like those
Is
really,
that-
really big dogs that are like horses.
Oh yeah.
I
Most
recall
breeds
that
of dogs that are really, really
Saint
tall.
Bernards.
So Great Danes have circulation issues. Saint Bernards have circulation and respiratory issues. Yeah.
Don't bunnies have a lot of issues too? Because I heard when they're like chasing their prey, they go into cardiac arrest sometimes.
Bunnies chasing prey. When
I
they're,
mean, so
when they're running from
when
predators.
bunnies are running from
Yeah.
like because we
I
had a
don't
bunny
know.
that was running from a coyote in our yard and it like went into cardiac arrest and was dead.
Yeah. I don't know. Carrie.
Like,
Sloths?
aren't they really so like digesting so they can like die even though
I don't know. I don't know that much about sloths, but I do know the world sloth expert, and I can give you her contact information if you want to ask her about sloths. I'm not lying. I met her at a conference, and she is the world expert on sloths. I know very little about sloths. Well, I don't know if she'd answer your email, but
Could she come into class and we could ask her questions about sloths?
Duck angle.
I don't know. I don't know if she would come. Isa.
What about pugs? They're like
Pugs have a ton of respiratory issues.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this is because of genetic drift, where you have features that are really harmful, really bad for these organisms. A lot of it has to do with genetic drift. All right? Okay. That's pretty much it from chapter 23 that we need to talk about, except for one last factor. And that's this question. If natural selection is adaptive, okay? So if natural selection is adaptive, that is, it's making populations better equipped for their particular environmental needs. Why aren't populations perfectly adapted for their environment? Okay?
So if natural selection is adaptive.
If natural selection is adaptive, and that is, what that means is through time, it is selecting for the features that make the population better equipped for its environmental needs. So over time, bless you, the population should become better equipped to live in the environment that it lives in. Right? Make sense? So if natural selection is adaptive and natural selection is at work, why aren't populations perfectly adapted for their environment? Hang on, because we're going to I think the entire AP Chem class is going to come in and they've got to do some measurements. So what I want you to do, what we're going to do is we're going to take about 5 minutes. I want you to work with those around you, and I want you to come up with 5 reasons, 5 explanations for why, even if natural selection is at work, populations are not perfectly adapted for their environment. Okay? So I want you to take 5 minutes, come up with 5 reasons, working with those around you, and then we'll talk about them together, but we're probably, anyways, the AP Chem class is going to come in, they're going to create a disturbance, and so while that happens, you're already like talking through things, already having your own little mini disturbance, it'll better equip this population to handle how our environment's going to change. Yeah, Carrie.
When you say populations, do you mean one species or?
Yep, you bet. All right? Okay, so 5 minutes.